This video is sponsored by Miniswap GG. The most famous depiction of Nurgle has him sitting over a massive cauldron where he's brewing the terrifying plagues. However, the Death Guard are much more industrialized in their appearance and their overall techniques. I wanted to make a Death Guard who's much more like Nurgle, and that he goes around, gathers horrifying materials, and then brews them inside of a special cauldron that he then bottles up and unleashes onto the battlefield. And the Putrid Blight Kings felt like the best place to start. They do have that slightly more organic appearance, and the Icon Bearer had the perfect pose that I think would match of the character I'm trying to make. I did notice that a lot of the armor had this very specific battle damage, and while initially I didn't think I was able to kind of replicate it, it turns out that the engraving tool is the perfect tool for this job. Unlike the drill bit I used previously, this thing works a little bit slower and also doesn't damage as much, so you can go a little bit slower and be much more methodical in where you place the damage. Now, I did use a bit more extra to me than I needed, but that's because this extra messiness looks even better on a Nurgle unit rather than the clean sharp lines we otherwise would have had. Replacing the legs is always a bit of nerve-wracking because it never really goes well for me. I usually end up trashing the unit, but for once, somehow I tried going as slowly as possible, and when I finally placed it on top of the leg, I was kind of blown away because not only did it look perfect, but it appeared as if it was always there. However, something I didn't consider is that the chest was actually slightly impacting the knee, but it turns out there's a second option which looked even more Death Guardy in its appearance. Now, I'm sure you figured out by now that I am replacing all the parts with the Cataphractii armor, and that's because it is technically the most Death Guardy option and also had quite a few available in my collection. I tried mimicking the exact same battle damage on all of the armor pieces, and whenever I made the bullet groups, I always tried going for 3 of them. I really wanted to try and achieve an organic transition between the Cataphractii and the armor that's available on this unit. My initial idea was that I was simply going to shave down as much of this Terminator armor as possible and then place it on top of the existing armor. But I grossly overestimated the size of it, and in fact, I was going to have to do a lot more work than I previously thought. Something I was trying to avoid with this miniature is going with this massive mouth or gut sticking out of the stomach area, which by this step in the project I was beginning to realize would have made it incredibly easy, but I wanted to stick with this idea, so I tried my best to make it happen. It took quite a bit of time, but eventually I was able to essentially shave down the 3 pieces in such a way that when I finally placed it on top, it was going to create a smooth transition I was trying to achieve from the beginning. When I went to pick out the head, initially I thought I'd go for this very classical Death Guardy appearance, but in the end I chose to go for the normal Chaos Space Marine one. It felt like a more horrifying option and a reminder that before he sold his soul to Nurgle, this was a regular Space Marine. Now, instead of an injector pistol, he will have a massive staff, and that is also partially because he needs to use it to actually mix the ingredients inside of the cauldron, which will be sourcing from what I essentially call the skinny orcs in Age of Sigmar. Years ago, I picked up the Dominion box set, and honestly, it's just been a big pile of shame that I never really found a use for, but it turns out there's actually quite a bit that I can use for my Nurgle collection. The Cruel Boy hand was surprisingly in proportion to the rest of the Space Marines, so I didn't even have to worry about replacing that. I did make sure there was a second contact at the foot, as this way the staff will be a lot more secure. I also used just a bit of Tamiya to smooth up the area, as the grinding did leave it quite rough. Now, for his other hand, I chose this absolutely beautiful Power Claw, which will make it very easy for him to reap the ingredients from the ground and the unfortunates that are in front of him. After all, the best plague ingredients are those that are still moving and are fighting back against the disease. I took out the putty and left it for just a little bit for it to stiffen up, as I needed this stuff to act as a filler between the Putrid Blight King's body and the Terminator chest plate. Unfortunately, the previous posture of the arm required me to remove quite a massive chunk of it from the back to create an entirely new posture for the Power Claw. I really wanted this thing to feel heavy, and it's almost like it's sinking down from his body. Now, it turns out that the Putrid Blight Kings are no longer for sale, but I did manage to find one box on Miniswap GG, who are the sponsors of today's video. And Miniswap is a cool feature where you can see the original price of this box, so you know this one is being sold a few dollars higher. Now, I did find the other kits that use this Kitbash, and they were all available at a significant discount. Now, the Orc is technically $30, and just for a staff and a cauldron, it's kind of expensive, but there is this bundle for $60, which contains a bunch of different little orcs, and also a mounted character, which is a little bit more intriguing, and for $60, a little bit more justifiable if you're gonna pick up all of them. But regardless of what you pick, on Miniswap, you have free shipping on your first order, so it's a pretty nice bonus. They also offer buyer's protection so that you know you're getting the miniatures you paid for, or you get your money back. Well, on Miniswap, I also checked out the new Blight Kings, and honestly, they look nothing like the originals, and even worse, they're unfortunately monopose. Now, if you have some minis you don't want, you can also sell the Miniswap, who offers some really nice tools to make the process a bit faster. For example, you just type in the name of the box, and it'll fill in all the information for you. And if you use my link in the pinned comment or the description, you'll also get no seller fees for the first 3 months. Again, thank you Miniswap.gg for sponsoring this episode, and back to the video. For the back, I did consider giving him the classical Terminator power pack, however, it wasn't really gonna fit. And even if I placed it, it was going to be covered up by this very beautiful collection of potions and different ingredients that he's going to be carrying around with him. The main visual I wanted from him is to look bloated and decayed. However, there was one mutation that I knew was going to look fantastic. Similar to my previous alternative Death Guard, I wanted these tentacles to essentially be reaching out and grabbing the staff. The way Nurgle gifts work is that quite often, even the Death Guard don't know their true purpose. But they do not question it, because Grandpa Nurgle always has a purpose for his gifts. In this case, the 3 tentacles will allow him to hold the staff while he essentially has a free hand to grab on those vile potions and chuck them at the enemy. And of course, reaching the ingredients at the back will be incredibly difficult, so the tentacles act in unison to hand him the stuff that he needs. Now for the Cauldron, I did have something special in mind. Demons in 40k can take a physical form. For example, Abaddon's sword is one of the most famous examples, but in my case, it's gonna be a Cauldron. A Cauldron for the first plague on the starship that wiped out its entire crew. So it's powerful enough to amplify whatever goes inside of it and make it much more deadlier and foul. However, it's not so powerful that it can easily overpower a Death Guard, so he still has control over it. And to help spread the plague, we're gonna have a bunch of flies coming out from the top of the Cauldron. And a Nurgling is gonna be riding the wave of flies and swinging around a putrid blight grenade. And he couldn't be happier about it. They also added this crude rotten shoulder pad to the arm holding the staff. Now I wanted to go for the classical Death Guard green, but I didn't have that color. However, it turns out making it surprisingly easy. All you need is just a little bit of frog green that you then mix in with black to essentially darken the color and desaturate it, and then a bit of white to brighten it while also desaturating it in the process. Now, in the previous video, when I was painting my Horsemen of the Apocalypse, I ended up using a lot of streaking grime, which I haven't used in quite some time, and honestly, the results were absolutely fantastic, and it was a really fun way to paint the miniature. So for this Death Guard, I tried repeating the exact same process, but essentially focusing on going with very bright highlights, while also trying to imagine what are they gonna look like once I have a bit of that dark streaking grime, creating the necessary shadows. I also experimented by applying an additional layer of highlights, and this is to avoid painting on top of the streaking grime. With everything prepped and ready, it was finally time to take out the streaking grime and do the fun step that I was really looking forward to. I used quite an excessive and thick version of streaking grime by trying to scrape it from the bottom because I really wanted to create a much darker version than what I would usually go for. Now, without allowing it to dry like usual, I started removing the streaking grime. I also wanted to create a bit of extra weathering, not just create some darker shadows, so I used the Q-tip in a rolling motion, allowing it to create this very disgusting and slimy texture that you would expect on a Death Guard. With the results turning out absolutely fantastic, but more than that, it was also just a really fun way to paint. After varnishing the miniature, I did come back with just a little bit of highlights to try to make my potions and plagues look a little bit more toxic, while also adding a few tiny details that I knew would make it a little bit better. And with a few finishing touches, my putrid Alchemist and his Demon Cauldron ready. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.